October 12, 1960, 3:47 p.m. United Nations General Assembly Hall, New York City. The temperature inside the hall hovers at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air feels heavier than the numbers suggest. Outside, on First Avenue, autumn rain has begun to tap against the enormous glass windows that separate this chamber from Manhattan's bustling streets. Inside, 2,000 delegates sit beneath fluorescent lights that bathe the vast room in sterile white. The air conditioning hums with mechanical indifference, but it cannot cool the tension building in the spaces between wooden desks and leather chairs. At desk number 101, in the third row of the Soviet delegation, a stocky man in a gray woolen suit sits motionless. His face is flushed, the color rising from his thick neck to his round cheeks. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, premier of the world's second superpower, commander of the largest land army on Earth, has been sitting in this chair for nearly 3 weeks. His hands rest on the polished wood surface before him. The fingers of his right hand drum slowly, rhythmically against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. His eyes are fixed on the rostrum 50 feet away, where Lorenzo Sumulong, delegate from the Republic of the Philippines, stands speaking. Sumulong's voice carries across the chamber with measured precision, the tone of a lawyer making his closing argument. He speaks of colonialism, of subjugation, of peoples deprived of freedom. He speaks of territories absorbed against their will. His words hang in the air like accusations waiting to land. Khrushchev's breathing deepens. The rhythm of his fingers changes, faster now. His right foot begins to tap beneath the desk, where no one can see it. Not yet. Behind him, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko leans forward slightly in his chair, his face a mask of diplomatic stone. His eyes flick from Khrushchev's back to the rostrum and back again. He knows this posture. He has seen it before. To Khrushchev's left, delegates from Poland and Bulgaria shift in their seats. One of them clears his throat. Another uncrosses his legs and recrosses them. They have seen this too. They know what is coming. Lorenzo Sumulong continues. His words are careful, diplomatic, wrapped in the formal language of international law and United Nations protocol. But their meaning is unmistakable. He mentions Eastern Europe. He speaks of Hungary, of Poland, of Romania. He uses the phrase deprived of political and civil rights. Then he says it, the phrase that will change everything. Nations that have been swallowed up, so to speak, by the Soviet Union. The words settle over the hall like smoke. Khrushchev's hand stops drumming. For 3 seconds, there is no movement at desk 101. No sound, no gesture. Just a stocky man in a gray suit, frozen, his chest rising and falling with each breath that comes faster now, deeper now. Then his jaw clenches. The hall around him continues in its routine. A delegate from Ghana whispers something to his colleague. A secretary in the press gallery flips through her notes. Assembly President Frederick Boland, seated at the elevated rostrum, glances at his watch. The world continues turning, unaware that it is about to witness something it will never forget. What happened next would shock everyone in the room. But this wasn't the real beginning. 3 weeks earlier, on the morning of September 20, 1960, Nikita Khrushchev had stepped off the Soviet liner Baltica at Pier 73 on Manhattan's west side. He was expecting something close to a diplomatic triumph. His advisors had assured him the trip would be a demonstration of Soviet power to a watching world. The 15th session of the United Nations General Assembly would be the grandest gathering of world leaders in history. Eisenhower, Macmillan, Nehru, Nasser, Tito, Sukarno, Castro, all of them converging on this island of steel and glass to decide the future of a world divided between two visions, two systems, two armies poised on opposite sides of an ideological chasm. Moscow had sent Khrushchev to New York with clear instructions. Demonstrate strength. Court the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia. Expose American hypocrisy, and above all, force the world to take the Soviet Union seriously as an equal, No, as a superior to the United States. The Kremlin viewed the United Nations as theater, a stage upon which Khrushchev could perform. But in Washington, American intelligence agencies had drawn very different conclusions about what this performance would achieve. In a classified briefing delivered to President Dwight D. Eisenhower on September 15, 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles characterized the Soviet premier as emotionally volatile, prone to theatrical gestures designed to mask strategic weakness, ultimately manageable through calculated diplomatic isolation. The assessment continued in clinical language. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of overreaction to perceived slights. Recommendation: deny him the respect he seeks. Let him exhaust himself. Let him reveal his true nature to the neutral nations, whose allegiance remains in question. Secretary of State Christian Herter went further. In a confidential memorandum dated September 15, he wrote directly to Eisenhower, "Khrushchev's presence at the United Nations represents an opportunity we must not squander. Let him speak. Let him shout. Let him pound tables and make demands. His histrionics will serve American interests better than any speech our delegation could deliver. The more extreme his behavior, the more clearly the world will see that the Soviet leadership is neither stable nor suitable for partnership." They were counting on his rage. They were engineering it. They believed they could control it, channel it, use it as a weapon against him. They were counting on one thing above all: that there existed a floor to his fury, a point beyond which he would not descend because the cost to Soviet prestige would be too great. They were wrong. The provocation began immediately. When Khrushchev's motorcade attempted to leave the pier, U.S. authorities informed the Soviet delegation that their movement would be restricted to Manhattan Island. Security measures, they called it, for the premier's own safety. Khrushchev could not travel beyond a narrow radius without advance permission. The leader of a superpower, confined like a criminal under house arrest. On September 23rd, when Khrushchev delivered his opening address to the General Assembly, he spoke for 2 hours and 26 minutes without pause. His voice grew hoarse. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He demanded the immediate removal of UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, whom he accused of being a puppet of Western imperialism, a tool of colonial powers who had no business leading an organization meant to represent all nations equally. He proposed replacing Hammarskjöld with a troika: 3 men, one representing the West, one representing the socialist world, one representing the newly independent nations. The proposal was met with polite silence, then swift rejection. On September 29th, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan rose to address the Assembly. His tone was measured, his arguments precise, his delivery impeccable in its aristocratic calm. Midway through his speech, Khrushchev began to shout. He pounded his desk with both fists. He waved his arms over his head. He interrupted Macmillan repeatedly, bellowing in Russian, his voice echoing off the chamber's high ceiling. Macmillan paused. He turned slowly toward the Soviet delegation. He looked directly at Khrushchev, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if he had just heard a dog bark in the distance. Then, in a voice of studied aristocratic calm, he said, "I should like that to be translated, if I may." Laughter rippled through the chamber, not loud, not cruel, just enough. Just sufficient to make the point. The man shouting was not being taken seriously. He was entertainment. Khrushchev sat down. His face was the color of raw meat. Western delegations exchanged glances. Knowing glances. The plan was working. Push him, provoke him, let him spiral. Let the world see what Soviet character had sent them. Not a statesman, but a peasant in a suit. British intelligence officer Daphne Park, stationed in New York for the summit, later told her biographer, "We knew exactly what we were doing. Khrushchev's psychology was an open book. Insecurity masked as bluster. Desperation for respect masked as aggression. The more we denied him what he wanted, the more violently he would demand it. And the more violent his demands, the less seriously the world would take him." On October 3rd, Khrushchev launched into a tirade against Secretary General Hammarskjöld, so vitriolic, so personal, so laden with accusations of treachery and corruption, that even delegates from the Soviet bloc shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Bulgarian Foreign Minister Karlo Lukyanov whispered to his deputy, "He has lost all sense of proportion." But the miscalculation went deeper than anyone realized at the time, because the Western strategy assumed something fundamental, that Khrushchev cared more about Soviet prestige than about his own wounded pride, that he would stop before crossing the line into self-destruction, that he would recognize the moment when further escalation would damage his country's standing in the world. They assumed he could see that line. They assumed there was a line. But things were about to get worse. To understand why this moment mattered, we need to go back, not to September, but to May, not to New York, but to the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. On May 1st, 1960, at 8:55 in the morning Moscow time, high above the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk, 70,000 feet above the Earth where the sky fades from blue to black, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Francis Gary Powers was sliced from the sky by a Soviet S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile. The explosion tore the plane apart. The tail section separated from the fuselage. The wings sheared off. The cockpit tumbled through thin air. Powers, fighting unconsciousness, fought his way out of the disintegrating aircraft and pulled his parachute ripcord at 14,000 feet. He descended slowly, watching pieces of his plane falling around him like burning snow. Soviet farmers watched him land in a field outside Sverdlovsk. Within minutes, KGB officers arrived. They took him into custody. They recovered the wreckage, camera equipment, classified photographs, navigation charts, everything that proved beyond any doubt that the aircraft had been on a spy mission deep inside Soviet territory. For 4 years, the United States had been systematically violating Soviet airspace, photographing military installations, nuclear facilities, missile sites, submarine bases. And for 4 years, Moscow had known, but could do nothing because Soviet missiles could not reach the altitude at which the U-2 flew. Until May 1st, 1960. Until the S-75 Dvina reached 70,000 feet and brought Francis Gary Powers back to Earth. President Eisenhower's government immediately issued a cover story. The aircraft was a NASA weather research plane that had strayed off course due to oxygen system failure. The pilot had blacked out. It was an accident. There was no espionage involved. On May 7th, Nikita Khrushchev stood before the Supreme Soviet in Moscow and revealed the truth to a stunned audience. The pilot was alive, uninjured, in custody. The plane had been recovered largely intact. The photographs were clear, the cameras were sophisticated, and the American government had been lying. The Paris summit, scheduled for May 16, collapsed before it began. Khrushchev demanded an apology. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev demanded punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower offered only a suspension of flights for the remainder of his presidency. Khrushchev stormed out. The summit ended on May 17 with no agreements, no joint statements, no progress toward the arms control treaty that it had been its entire purpose. The fragile détente built over 2 years, Khrushchev's 1959 visit to America, the Camp David talks with Eisenhower, the spirit of Camp David that had briefly suggested the Cold War might end through negotiation rather than apocalypse, shattered in a single week. By September 1960, the temperature of the Cold War had returned to its coldest point since Stalin's death. The Berlin crisis simmered. The nuclear arms race accelerated. The world was dividing into armed camps, and the middle ground where reasonable men might meet was vanishing. But the damage to Khrushchev was deeper than geopolitical. It was personal. It was political. It was existential. In Moscow, hardliners in the Politburo who had never trusted Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence now had evidence that they had been right all along. The Americans could not be trusted. Defense Minister Rodion Malinsky told colleagues, "Khrushchev's weakness has invited this humiliation. Stalin would never have tolerated such an insult." Party ideologue Mikhail Suslov circulated a memo arguing that Khrushchev's entire foreign policy had been based on naive optimism about capitalist intentions. The U-2 incident had made Khrushchev look foolish before his own people, his own party, his own military. He had staked his political credibility on the idea that the Soviet Union could negotiate with the United States as an equal. And Eisenhower had responded by sending spy planes into Soviet airspace and then lying about it. This was the context in which Khrushchev came to New York in September 1960. He came humiliated. He came angry. He came convinced that the West had made him look weak, and weakness in Moscow was death. He came with something to prove, not to the Americans, but to the men in the Kremlin who were watching him, judging him, waiting for him to fail so they could replace him with someone stronger. And so when the Baltica docked at Pier 73 on September 20, Khrushchev did not come as a statesman seeking compromise. He came as a man seeking vindication. He came ready to fight. The American strategy was to let him fight, to let him exhaust himself, to let him reveal himself to be unfit for leadership on the world stage. But there was another player in this drama, one that neither Washington nor Moscow had fully accounted for. On September 19, the day before Khrushchev arrived, Castro, young, bearded, barely 20 months in power, checked into the Shelburne Hotel in Midtown Manhattan as part of the Cuban delegation to the United Nations. Within hours, he had a dispute with the hotel management over money, over security deposits, over what he later claimed was racial discrimination against the black and mixed-race members of his delegation. Castro stormed out. He threatened to sleep in Central Park. Then he announced he would set up camp in the Rose Garden of the United Nations compound itself. UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld was horrified. That's when Malcolm X stepped in. The young minister from the Nation of Islam, already a rising voice in Black America's struggle for justice, offered Castro an alternative. The Hotel Teresa in Harlem, a Black-owned establishment in the heart of Black America. Castro accepted immediately. On September 20th, while Khrushchev was still crossing the Atlantic, Fidel Castro relocated his entire delegation to Harlem. He held a press conference on the sidewalk outside the Hotel Teresa. He ate lunch with the black hotel workers, drinking beer and eating steak while photographers captured every moment. That evening, Malcolm X came to his suite. They talked for hours about colonialism, imperialism, race, revolution. The next morning, September 20th, Nikita Khrushchev made his first move in response to Castro's audacious relocation. He traveled to Harlem himself. The Soviet premier, leader of a nation that officially had no racial problems, drove through the streets of America's most famous black neighborhood to embrace Castro outside the Hotel Teresa. The image was broadcast around the world. The Soviet giant and the Caribbean rebel, united in Harlem, united against American imperialism. It was pure theater. It was perfect propaganda. And it told Khrushchev something important. Audacity worked. The world paid attention to those brave enough to break the rules, to defy protocol, to shock. But beneath the surface, those who knew Khrushchev well could see something else happening. Eastern Bloc delegates noticed it first. At private dinners in Soviet-controlled estates on Long Island, Khrushchev ranted about Eisenhower, about the U-2, about the disrespect shown to the Soviet Union. His speeches at the UN grew longer, more erratic, more personal. The diplomatic cables he sent back to Moscow grew angrier with each passing day. His personal interpreter, Viktor Sukadrev, would later recall, By early October, those of us close to him could see he was not himself. He was exhausted, yes, the schedule was brutal, but more than that, he was wounded. The U-2 had wounded him in a way that would not heal, and wounded animals are the most dangerous. The United Nations General Assembly had become a pressure cooker. Steam was building, the relief valve was blocked, and on October 12, Lorenzo Sumolong was about to apply more heat. No one in the room understood the consequences. October 12, 1960, 3:49 p.m. Lorenzo Sumolong is still speaking. His voice remains measured, controlled, the tone of a man confident in the righteousness of his position. He is addressing a Soviet resolution on decolonization, a resolution that condemns Western imperialism in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And Sumolong, representing a nation that had itself been colonized by Spain and then occupied by the United States, is making an argument that strikes at the heart of Soviet hypocrisy. "We are witnessing," Sumolong says, his Filipino accent giving a slight lilt to his English, "the deprivation of political and civil rights of the peoples of Eastern Europe. Nations that have been deprived of the free exercise of their sovereignty and independence. Nations that have been swallowed up, so to speak, by the Soviet Union." The phrase hangs in the air. Swallowed up. At Desk 101, Nikita Khrushchev's face changes. The flush deepens from red to purple. His hands, which had been resting flat on the desk, curl into fists. He rises from his seat. Not slowly, not with the measured dignity one expects from a head of state standing to make a point of order. He erupts upward. His chair is knocked backward with a clatter that echoes through the hall like a gunshot. Delegates turn. Conversations stop mid-sentence. A woman in the press gallery drops her pen. Khrushchev is shouting, in Russian. His voice is raw, guttural, stripped of any pretense of diplomatic restraint. He waves his right arm in a wide, violent arc, pointing across the chamber at Lorenzo Sumolong, who is frozen at the rostrum. "Chalui, stavlendik imperializma." The simultaneous translators scramble. The phrase comes through their headsets. Lackey, stooge of imperialism. But Khrushchev is not finished. He's moving now, walking, no, striding down the aisle between the Soviet delegation and the Polish delegation. His movements jerky, uncoordinated, the movements of a man no longer in control of his body because his rage has taken the controls. He stops approximately 15 feet from Lorenzo Sumolong. For a moment, the two men face each other across the chamber. The distance between them is physical, but the gulf is historical. The colonized versus the colonizor. The dominated versus the dominator, except neither man is certain anymore which role he occupies. Khrushchev sweeps his right arm upward in a theatrical gesture of dismissal, as if he could brush Sumolong aside without touching him. Then he launches into a denunciation that is less speech than primal scream. The words tumble over each other in Russian. Colonialism, hypocrisy, American puppet, Philippine disgrace, Western lies, capitalist crimes. Assembly President Frederick Boland of Ireland tries to intervene. His voice, amplified through the chamber's sound system, cuts through the chaos. The delegate from the Soviet Union will return to his seat. Khrushchev ignores him completely. He continues shouting, his face contorted, spittle flying from his lips. The delegate will observe the rules of this assembly. Khrushchev gestures wildly, his arms flailing as if he were fighting invisible enemies. Boland's voice rises, taking on an edge of real authority. "I call the Soviet delegate to order." For a moment, Khrushchev seems not to hear. Then something in Boland's tone penetrates his rage. Khrushchev turns. He looks at Boland. Then he walks back to his desk, his steps heavy, his breathing audible even 20 feet away. But he does not sit. He remains standing, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on Lorenzo Sumolong with an intensity that makes several nearby delegates lean away from him.
Sumolong, to his credit, attempts to resume his speech. "As I was saying," he begins, his voice steady despite the interruption, "the peoples of Eastern Europe and elsewhere which have been deprived—" That's when it happens. Khrushchev bends down. The motion is sudden, awkward, almost violent in its abruptness. There is very little space beneath the wooden desk where the delegates sit. These furnishings were not designed for spontaneous physical demonstrations. But Khrushchev manages to reach down into the cramped space beneath desk 101. What he is reaching for has been there for several hours. Earlier that afternoon, at approximately 2:15 p.m., a journalist from a French newspaper had accidentally stepped on Khrushchev's foot in the crowded aisle during a brief recess. The collision had dislodged his right shoe, a simple brown loafer, slip-on style, manufactured in West Germany and imported to Moscow as part of a trade agreement for 30,000 pairs of civilian footwear. A UN security staffer attempting to be helpful had retrieved the shoe, wrapped it carefully in a linen napkin, and returned it to the Soviet premier, who had found he could not put it back on in the cramped space of his seat. The shoe had been sitting on the floor beside desk 101 ever since, largely forgotten. Until now. Khrushchev straightens. The shoe is in his right hand. A simple, brown leather loafer, size 10 European, slightly worn at the heel, the sole showing scuff marks from weeks of walking through hotel corridors and UN hallways. For a fraction of a second, perhaps half a heartbeat, the General Assembly Hall is silent. 2,000 people holding their breath. Every eye in the chamber locked on desk 101. Then Khrushchev brings the shoe down on the desk. Thunk. The sound is not loud. The sole is leather, the desk is wood. The impact is muffled. But in this moment, in this silence, with 2,000 people watching, it is deafening. It is the sound of something breaking. Not the desk, something else. Something invisible, but essential, the thin membrane of diplomatic protocol that separates statesmen from street fighters, civilization from savagery. He does it again. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Methodically, rhythmically, each blow harder than the last. His wristwatch, a Soviet-made Pobeda, presented to him by the Central Committee on his 60th birthday, flies off his wrist from the force of the impact and skitters across the polished wood surface. This only enrages him further, as if the watch had betrayed him for refusing to stay on his wrist while he makes his point. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The banging continues, 10 seconds, 15, 20. Each impact sending a shock through the desk, through the floor, through the foundations of international diplomacy itself. Delegates are on their feet now. Some in shock, their faces frozen in expressions of disbelief. Some in outrage, their mouths forming protests that never quite emerge. Some in something approaching fear, because what they are witnessing is not political theater, it is unraveling. The photographers in the press gallery above the assembly floor scramble for their cameras, but they are too slow or perhaps too stunned to react quickly enough. Years later, many will claim that they were prevented from photographing the incident, that security personnel blocked their view, but the truth is simpler. For those crucial 20 seconds, the men and women whose job was to record history were too shocked by what they were seeing to remember to press their shutters. Andrei Gromyko, seated directly behind Khrushchev, has turned to stone. His face betrays nothing, but his hands are gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles have gone white. The veteran diplomat who has served under Stalin, who has survived purges and power struggles that killed better men, knows what he is witnessing. Career suicide. Not his own. Khrushchev's. Across the chamber, the American delegation sits in collective paralysis. Ambassador James Jeremiah Wadsworth stares at the Soviet desk. His deputy, Francis T.P. Plimpton, has his hand halfway to his face, frozen in mid-gesture. Neither man moves. Neither man speaks. They are watching something they had planned for, hoped for, calculated would happen, but now that it is happening, now that they are seeing it, they realize they have engineered something they don't entirely understand. Harold Macmillan, seated with the British delegation, watches with the expression of a man witnessing a traffic accident. Later he will tell an aide, "In all my years in public service, and I have served through 2 world wars, through the collapse of empires, through crises that brought us to the brink of annihilation, I have never witnessed such a complete loss of control from a man in such a position of power." Frederick Boland raises his gavel. Thor's gavel, they call it, carved from Norwegian oak, a symbol of order and authority. He brings it down once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoes through the chamber, competing with the rhythmic thunking of Khrushchev's shoe. And then the gavel snaps. The head flies off, tumbling through the air in a perfect arc, and lands with a sharp crack on the marble floor 15 feet from the rostrum. The sound of the breaking gavel is what finally stops Khrushchev.
The sound of the breaking gavel is what finally stops Khrushchev. He looks down at the shoe in his hand, then at the broken gavel lying on the floor, then at Frederick Boland, who is standing, with the handle still gripped in his fist, staring at it as if it has betrayed him. For 3 seconds, something like awareness crosses Khrushchev's face. Something like recognition that he has crossed a line from which there is no return. He sets the shoe on the desk, carefully, almost gently, as if the shoe were fragile, as if it might break. Then he sits down. Frederick Boland's voice, when it finally emerges, is quiet, but carries the weight of absolute authority. This session is adjourned. The hall empties in waves. Delegates file out in near silence, like mourners leaving a funeral. No one speaks, no one makes eye contact. Everyone understands that they have witnessed something that cannot be taken back, cannot be explained away, cannot be forgotten. Outside on First Avenue, the autumn rain has stopped. The streets are wet and dark and reflect the lights of the United Nations building in pools of yellow and white. Inside Desk 101, a brown leather loafer sits on polished wood, marking the exact spot where the Cold War entered a new phase. But the real consequences had only just begun. The news hit the wire services within 30 minutes. At 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, United Press International transmitted to its global network of newspapers, "Urgent, Soviet Premier Khrushchev banged shoe on desk at UN, disrupting General Assembly session." At 4:23 p.m., Associated Press followed. Flash, Khrushchev uses shoe to protest Philippine delegate speech, breaking diplomatic protocol. At 4:31 p.m., Reuters cabled London. Extraordinary scenes at United Nations as Soviet leader loses composure, pounds shoe on desk repeatedly before stunned delegates. By 5 p.m., the story was on radio broadcasts across 5 continents. By 6 p.m., the first newspapers were remaking their front pages, pushing aside stories about the presidential election campaign between Kennedy and Nixon, pushing aside coverage of African independence movements, pushing aside everything else to make room for a single image that would define this moment in history. The New York Times, October 13, 1960. Noisy UN session cut short to end heckling by Reds. Khrushchev waves shoe and bangs desk. Washington Post. Soviet premier's shoe-banging tantrum shocks assembly. Khrushchev loses control during Philippine delegate speech. Le Monde. Khrushchev perd son sang-froid devant l'Assemblée générale. Le chef soviétique frappe son bureau avec sa chaussure. The Guardian. Khrushchev's shoe incident marks new low in East-West diplomatic relations. Pravda. Soviet edition. Heavily censored. Premier Khrushchev vigorously defends socialist principles at United Nations against imperialist provocations. The photograph ran on front pages across the world. Khrushchev seated at his desk, a shoe clearly visible on the polished wood surface, Andrei Gromyko's face in the background frozen in an expression of controlled horror. What the photograph could not capture, what no camera succeeded in recording, was the actual moment of the banging. Decades later, researchers would scour archives searching for film footage or photographic evidence of the shoe striking the desk. They would find none. But the shoe sitting there on the desk was proof enough. Everyone who had been in that chamber knew what they had seen, and what they had seen could not be unseen. In the hours immediately following the incident, as delegates filed out of the UN building and scattered across Manhattan to their hotels and embassies and secure phone lines, the true scale of what had just happened began to emerge. At the Soviet delegation's temporary headquarters, a requisitioned estate in Glen Cove, Long Island, 30 miles from Manhattan, Khrushchev's staff moved through the rooms in stunned silence. No one knew what to say. The protocol officers, who should have been preparing briefing documents for tomorrow's sessions, instead sat at their desks staring at blank paper. The security personnel stationed outside Khrushchev's private quarters reported hearing him pacing back and forth for hours. The sound of his footsteps continued until well past midnight. Through the closed door, aides could hear him talking to himself in Russian. The words were too muted to distinguish clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage mixed with something else, something that sounded like despair. Eastern Bloc delegates were in immediate crisis management mode. The Polish ambassador to the United Nations, Bohdan Lewandowski, sent an encrypted cable to Warsaw at 6:45 p.m. Khrushchev incident represents catastrophic failure of Soviet diplomatic strategy. Every anti-communist propagandist in the world now has their symbol. We appear not as defenders of oppressed peoples, but as buffoons incapable of civilized discourse. Recommend immediate distancing from Soviet position. The Bulgarian delegation's report to Sofia was even more damning. The premier's behavior has undermined years of patient diplomatic work. We are no longer taken seriously as participants in international discourse. The image of the Soviet bloc has been irreparably damaged. Junior diplomats from neutral nations are openly mocking us in the UN cafeteria. The Czechoslovakian Foreign Ministry received a telegram from its UN delegation that read simply, "Disaster. Will explain upon return. Prepare contingency plans for damage control." But it was the neutral nations, the very audience Khrushchev had come to New York to court, to impress, to recruit into the Soviet sphere of influence, whose reactions mattered most. India's Jawaharlal Nehru, the elder statesman of the non-aligned movement, a man who had carefully maintained equidistance between Washington and Moscow for more than a decade, was asked by reporters at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for his reaction to the incident. He paused for a long moment before responding. Then he chose his words with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Passion in defense of one's principles is understandable, but theatrics undermine the very principles one seeks to defend. There is a difference between strength and spectacle. What we witnessed today was spectacle. The Indian delegation's classified cable to New Delhi was more blunt. Khrushchev's behavior confirms Western characterization of Soviet leadership as unstable and unsuitable for partnership. Recommend continued policy of non-alignment, but with increased skepticism towards Soviet reliability. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had met with Khrushchev just days earlier at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, who had been photographed embracing the leader in what appeared to be genuine warmth, sent a private message to Cairo that would not be declassified for decades. The Americans have achieved a victory without firing a shot. They baited Khrushchev into destroying his own credibility. He took the bait. The non-aligned nations cannot afford to align ourselves with a leader who cannot control himself.
Our policy toward Moscow must be re-evaluated. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, perhaps the most socialist-leaning of Africa's new leaders, confided to an aide that evening, "How can we trust a man who behaves like a child throwing a tantrum?" The imperialists want us to believe that socialism leads to barbarism, and today Khrushchev proved their point for them. Indonesia's Sukarno, who had publicly praised Soviet support for independence movements, privately told his foreign minister, "Khrushchev has given the West everything they wanted. He has made us all look foolish for believing the Soviet Union represented a civilized alternative." The Western response was more calculated, more controlled, but no less devastating. In Washington, President Eisenhower was briefed on the incident at 4:15 p.m. while meeting with advisors in the Oval Office. According to notes taken by his personal secretary, Ann Rittman, Eisenhower listened to the description of events in complete silence. When the briefing concluded, he removed his reading glasses, set them on his desk, and said only this: "That man has done more damage to his own cause in one afternoon than our entire State Department could accomplish in a year of speeches." At the State Department, Secretary Christian Herter convened an emergency meeting of senior officials at 5:30 p.m. The mood in the room was, according to one participant, somewhere between elation and disbelief. Herter's instructions were precise. "We say nothing. We do not gloat. We do not comment. We let the incident speak for itself. Our silence will be more powerful than any statement we could make." At the British Foreign Office in London, a classified memorandum circulated among senior officials within hours. Khrushchev's behavior at the United Nations confirms all assessments regarding Soviet leadership instability. The premier has demonstrated that he is neither psychologically nor temperamentally suited for serious diplomatic engagement. Policy recommendations continue pressure. The Soviet leadership is neither stable nor rational. Future negotiations must proceed from this assumption. The Central Intelligence Agency produced a comprehensive psychological profile of Khrushchev within 48 hours of the incident. The document, declassified in 1995, concluded, "Subject demonstrates profound inability to manage emotional responses under conditions of perceived disrespect. Exhibits poor impulse control, highly susceptible to provocation." Assessment: Subject's behavior at UN represents exploitable weakness. Recommendation: Continued application of calculated pressure will produce additional episodes of counterproductive behavior. Soviet prestige can be systematically undermined through strategic disrespect. But perhaps the most revealing response came from Fidel Castro. The Cuban leader had been seated near the Soviet delegation throughout the entire incident. Multiple witnesses would later recall that as Khrushchev began banging the shoe, Castro leaned forward in his seat, utterly mesmerized. His eyes were wide, his mouth hung slightly open. He watched every blow of the shoe against the desk with the intensity of a man witnessing a religious revelation. When it was over, when the session had been adjourned and delegates began filing out of the UN building, Castro turned to his translator and said something in rapid Spanish. The translator later reconstructed the words. "Eso no es debilidad. Eso es furia. Eso es exactamente lo que siente el mundo colonizado."
That is not weakness. That is fury. That is exactly what the colonized world feels. In Havana, weeks later, Castro would tell his inner circle, "Khrushchev showed them we will not be silent. We will not sit politely while they insult us. We will not accept their rules. That shoe was worth 1,000 speeches. That shoe said, we refuse to play your game." But Castro was wrong about something crucial, something he would not understand until years later, when he himself faced the choice between rage and strategy during the missile crisis. The world was not watching a colonized man finding his voice. The world was watching a superpower lose control. And there is a difference. By October 13, Cartoonists across 5 continents had produced their versions of the incident. In London, the Daily Mail ran a cartoon showing Khrushchev standing at the UN rostrum, wearing shoes on his hands like boxing gloves. In Paris, Le Figaro depicted him hurling footwear at a cowering globe. In Tokyo, an editorial cartoon showed Khrushchev's shoe crushing a dove of peace. In New Delhi, in Buenos Aires, in Lagos, in every major city with a printing press, the image was the same. The Soviet premier reduced to a clown. His superpower reduced to a joke. The Soviet Union had become a punchline. And Nikita Khrushchev, who had survived Stalin's purges by being cleverer than the men Stalin killed, who had denounced Stalin's crimes before the 20th Party Congress and lived to tell about it, who had crushed the Hungarian uprising with tanks and felt no remorse, who had put Sputnik into orbit and claimed the future belonged to communism, had reduced his nation's stature to the dimensions of a brown leather loafer. What no one realized yet was how deep the damage would go.
October 13th, 1960. Evening. Nikita Khrushchev left New York that night aboard the Soviet liner Baltica, departing from Pier 73 at 7:45 p.m. There were no farewell ceremonies, no diplomatic protocols, no crowds of well-wishers or protesters. The ship slipped into the East River under heavy fog, its lights dimmed, its passage almost furtive, like a criminal leaving the scene of a crime. On board, Khrushchev retreated immediately to his private cabin on the upper deck. His interpreter, Viktor Sukadrev, who had been at his side throughout the entire UN visit, later wrote in his memoirs, "He was not himself. He kept saying it had been necessary, that someone had to stand up to their insults, that the socialist world needed to see strength, not weakness." But his voice had no conviction. He was trying to convince himself, and failing. The Baltica crossed the Atlantic in silence. No parties, no celebrations. The Soviet delegation kept to their cabins. Meals were taken alone. The voyage that should have been a victory lap felt more like a funeral procession. The ship docked in Leningrad on October 19th. There were no crowds waiting. The Soviet press had reported Khrushchev's defense of socialist principles at the United Nations, but the reports were brief, carefully worded, stripped of detail. The shoe was not mentioned. The outburst was described as vigorous denunciation of imperialist provocations. But everyone knew. In Moscow, in Leningrad, in every city across the Soviet Union, people had heard the Western broadcasts. They had seen the photographs smuggled in through Finland and Poland. They knew what their premier had done. Back in Moscow, the reception was colder than the October air. The Politburo convened on October 21 without Khrushchev present. No official transcript of that meeting has ever been released from Soviet archives, but its consequences became brutally clear in the years that followed. According to accounts later provided by KGB defectors and Soviet officials who emigrated to the West, the meeting lasted 7 hours. And the subject was singular: Khrushchev's fitness for leadership. Leonid Brezhnev, who had been carefully consolidating power behind the scenes for months, saw his opportunity. According to testimony given decades later by Arkady Shevchenko, a Soviet diplomat who defected in 1978, Brezhnev remarked to Alexei Kosygin, "This is what happens when emotions replace strategy. This is what happens when personal grievances are allowed to dictate state policy. We cannot afford another incident like this." Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologist, was more direct. "Comrade Khrushchev has embarrassed the Soviet Union before the entire world. His behavior was beneath the dignity of a workers' state. It confirmed every capitalist stereotype about socialist barbarism." Even those who had supported Khrushchev's policies found themselves unable to defend his actions. Anastas Mikoyan, perhaps Khrushchev's closest ally in the Politburo, later told a journalist, "What could I say? That he was right to lose control? That the shoe was justified? There was no defense. He had given our enemies exactly what they wanted." Khrushchev's authority, already weakened by the U-2 fiasco and the collapse of the Paris summit, now faced sustained internal assault. Military hardliners argued that his policy of peaceful coexistence had been exposed as weakness, that the Americans had humiliated him because they knew he would not fight back. Economic ministers pointed to the incident as evidence of his unsuitability for leadership in an increasingly complex international environment. Party officials in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in the Baltic republics began distancing themselves from the premier, sensing that his political protection was evaporating. In November 1960, at a closed session of the Central Committee, the broader party body that technically supervised the Politburo, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko delivered what witnesses described as a devastating assessment of Soviet diplomatic standing post-UN. According to notes smuggled out by a KGB defector years later, Gromyko's statement included this passage: "Our conduct at the United Nations did not advance Soviet interests. It did not strengthen our position among the non-aligned nations. It did not intimidate our adversaries. It made us appear volatile, unreliable, and beneath the dignity of a great power. The Americans did not need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves." The room was silent when Gromyko finished speaking. Silent in a way that Soviet officials understood immediately. The consensus had shifted. Khrushchev was no longer untouchable. Khrushchev attempted to defend himself. In his own speech to the Central Committee, he framed the shoe incident as a calculated political act. "I remembered reading about the sessions of the Russian Duma before the revolution, where deputies would create noise and disruption to protest against injustices. I took off my shoe and pounded the desk so that our protest would be heard louder than the lies of the imperialists and their puppets." But his voice had no conviction. He was trying to convince himself, and failing. Over the following months, the shoe became code. In Politburo meetings, when Khrushchev proposed bold initiatives, accelerated missile deployment, aggressive postures in Berlin, support for revolutionary movements in the Third World, opponents would exchange knowing glances. "Another shoe," those glances said. "Another miscalculation. Another moment when emotion will override strategy." The incident had fundamentally altered the internal dynamics of Soviet power. Khrushchev could still give orders, could still make policy, could still command the apparatus of state, but he could no longer command respect. And in the Soviet system, where power derived from personal authority as much as from institutional position, respect was everything. By 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev found himself increasingly isolated in the Politburo. When he proposed placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, when he brought the world to within hours of thermonuclear annihilation, when he finally backed down and agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for American concessions that were kept secret, his colleagues saw confirmation of what they had suspected since October 1960. Nikita Khrushchev was unstable. He made bold moves based on emotion rather than calculation. He could not be trusted with the survival of the Soviet state. Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski told associates, "We were lucky in Cuba. We were lucky Khrushchev recognized the abyss before stepping into it, but we cannot count on luck. The next time, he might not stop." On October 14, 1964, almost exactly 4 years after the shoe incident, While Khrushchev vacationed at his Black Sea dacha in Crimea, the Politburo voted unanimously to remove him from power. The charges were numerous and detailed: economic failures, agricultural disasters that left Soviet citizens hungry, alienation of China that split the communist world, adventurism in foreign policy. But buried in the official resolution, carefully worded but unmistakable to anyone who understood Soviet political language, was this phrase: Comrade Khrushchev's tendency towards adventurism, uncontrolled behavior, and actions unbefitting the dignity of a Soviet leader. One witness to the proceedings, a junior Central Committee member who later emigrated to Israel, told Western journalists, "They mentioned the shoe without mentioning the shoe." Everyone in that room knew what they were talking about. The shoe had become the symbol of everything wrong with Khrushchev's leadership: impulsiveness, emotionalism, inability to control himself. They never forgot it, and in the end, it helped destroy him. Khrushchev accepted his removal without protest. He was too shrewd, too experienced in Soviet power struggles to fight back. He knew that men who fought their removal from power in the Soviet system often disappeared. He retired to a government dacha outside Moscow, where he lived under conditions that were comfortable but constrained. He was not arrested, he was not exiled, but he was erased. His name disappeared from newspapers, his image was removed from public spaces. He became a non-person, alive but invisible. In 1970, American journalist Strobe Talbott secured a rare interview with Khrushchev for what would become his memoir, Khrushchev Remembers. Talbott asked directly about the United Nations incident, about the shoe.
Khrushchev's response was defiant, almost cheerful. "Oh, it was such fun. You know, the UN is sort of a parliament, where the minority has to make itself known one way or another. We were in the minority at that time, but not for long. So I removed my shoe and pounded it on the desk. It made noise, attracted attention, and that was the point." But according to Talbott's notes, preserved in his papers at Yale University, Khrushchev's eyes while speaking these words told a different story. They were the eyes of a man still trying, after a decade, to convince himself that he had been right, that the shoe had been justified, that he had not destroyed himself over a moment of wounded pride. The eyes told the truth. He knew better. Lorenzo Sumilong, the Philippine delegate, whose words had triggered the explosion, served in various diplomatic posts for another decade before retiring to Manila. In interviews conducted late in his life, he expressed no pride in his role, no satisfaction in having provoked the Soviet premier. "I was simply stating facts," he said in a 1988 interview. "I was defending the peoples of Eastern Europe who had no voice of their own. I did not intend to provoke. I did not realize at the time that what I was witnessing was a man at the absolute end of his patience. But in retrospect, perhaps I should have known. Perhaps we all should have known that pushing a man that hard would eventually break something inside him." Frederick Boland, the Irish diplomat who served as UN General Assembly President, who had tried desperately to maintain order, who had broken Tarr's gavel trying to restore parliamentary procedure, he kept the broken handle as memento. It sits today in a display case at United Nations headquarters in New York, in a small museum dedicated to UN history. The label beneath it reads simply, "Gavel Handle, used by Assembly President Frederick Boland, broken October 12, 1960. The label does not mention why it broke, but everyone who sees it knows. The shoe itself disappeared. No museum claims it. No archive holds it. Soviet officials never retrieved it from the United Nations building, and American authorities never sought to preserve it. According to UN records, the shoe was collected by a janitor on the evening of October 12th, placed with other lost items in the storage room, and eventually discarded when no one claimed it. But its image endured. Its shadow lengthened. Its ghost haunted every Soviet diplomatic encounter for the remainder of the Cold War. For the next 25 years,
Whenever Soviet leaders appeared at international forums, at the UN, at summit meetings, at treaty negotiations, the question lingered in the back of every room like smoke. Will he lose control? Will there be another shoe? Will the mask slip again? The answer was always no, because after Khrushchev, Soviet leaders learned a crucial lesson that he never quite grasped. Power is not demonstrated through explosions. Power is demonstrated through the discipline to never explode, no matter the provocation, no matter the humiliation, no matter the pain. Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced Khrushchev, was boring. Deliberately, calculatedly boring. He read from prepared texts. He never improvised. He never raised his voice. He was the anti-Khrushchev, and that was precisely the point. But the question remained. What had really been lost that day? Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev died on September 11, 1971, in his dacha outside Moscow, in near total obscurity. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was heart failure. The Soviet state gave him a modest funeral, attended by a handful of officials whose careers had ended with his. There were no state honors, no lying in state, no public mourning. The government announcement of his death was brief. Former party official N.S. Khrushchev has died. A pension was granted to his family. Western newspapers noted his passing with obituaries that varied in length and tone, but nearly all of them mentioned the same moment, described the same image: a stocky man in a gray suit, standing at a wooden desk in the United Nations, banging his shoe against polished wood while 2,000 delegates watched in horror and fascination. History has struggled ever since to know what to do with that image, how to interpret it, what it means, what it says about power, about rage, about the fragile architecture of international order. Some see it as evidence of Soviet barbarism, final confirmation that the communist world was ruled by thugs in suits, men unfit for civilized discourse, incapable of controlling their animal impulses. To this interpretation, the shoe represents everything wrong with totalitarianism: its violence, its lack of restraint, its fundamental incompatibility with democratic norms. Others see it as an act of righteous fury, a colonized world's middle finger raised in defiance of imperial arrogance. To this interpretation, the shoe represents the rage of the powerless finding voice, the oppressed refusing to be silent, the subaltern speaking back to power in the only language power understands. Both interpretations are wrong. Or perhaps both are true, which amounts to the same thing. What happened on October 12, 1960, was neither barbarism nor righteousness. It was something simpler and more human and more tragic. A man pushed beyond his capacity to absorb humiliation, lashing out in the only way he knew how, and destroying himself in the process. The real tragedy of the shoe incident is not that Khrushchev lost control. Human beings lose control. It happens. Under sufficient pressure, under sufficient provocation, under sufficient pain, the mechanisms of self-regulation fail. This is not barbarism. This is biology. The tragedy is that his loss of control was so carefully engineered. American and British intelligence services understood Khrushchev's psychology better than he understood it himself. They knew his insecurities, his wounds, his desperate need to be taken seriously by the Western powers that had treated Russia as a backward peasant nation for centuries. They knew that his bluster masked profound anxiety about Soviet weakness. They knew that behind his confident predictions of communist victory lurked genuine fear that the Soviet system was failing, that the promises were lies, that history might not be on their side after all. And they weaponized that knowledge. The U-2 incident was not just an intelligence operation, it was psychological warfare. Send a spy plane over Soviet territory, get caught, lie about it, force Khrushchev to prove the lie, then refuse to apologize, each step calculated to maximize humiliation. Then invite him to New York and isolate him, restrict his movements, deny him respect, provoke him through proxies, and wait for the inevitable explosion. The shoe incident was not an accident. It was the endpoint of a deliberate strategy: isolate, humiliate, provoke, let him destroy himself on camera. Let the world see what we see, not a superpower, but a man in a suit barely holding himself together. And it worked.
perfectly, devastatingly. But the cost was higher than anyone in Washington or London realized at the time, because in humiliating Khrushchev, in destroying his credibility, in forcing his removal from power, the West did not weaken Soviet resolve. They hardened it. The men who replaced Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Kosygin, Andropov, Gromyko were colder, more calculating, more paranoid, less willing to negotiate, less willing to take risks en détente. The arms race accelerated. The Berlin Wall went up in 1961. Vietnam became a proving ground for superpower proxy warfare. The world grew darker, more dangerous, closer to annihilation. And all of it traced back, in some small but significant part, to a brown shoe on a wooden desk. The lesson is not about anger. Anger is inevitable. Anger is human. Anger, properly channeled, can be a force for justice. The lesson is about systems that feed on anger, that weaponize it, that turn human emotion into geopolitical theater, that punish authenticity and reward performance. On that October afternoon in 1960, 2,000 delegates watched a man lose his dignity in public. What they did not see, what none of them could see, because the mechanisms were invisible, was that his dignity had been systematically stripped away by an architecture designed to produce exactly that result. The United Nations was built to prevent war, to provide a forum where nations could resolve disputes through words rather than weapons. But it was also built on the ruins of colonial empires, on the anxieties of nuclear powers, on the deep suspicion that the other side was not fully human, not fully rational, not fully deserving of respect. Khrushchev banged his shoe because he felt invisible. Because words, speeches, resolutions, diplomatic notes, formal protests had lost their power to change anything. Because the West had violated Soviet airspace, had lied about it, had refused to apologize, and had faced no consequences. Because no one was listening. He was not entirely wrong. But he was not right either. Because what happened after the shoe is what always happens. The powerful wrote the story, and the story made him small. The incident became proof of Soviet inferiority, of communist barbarism, of the fundamental unsuitability of the Soviet system for partnership with civilized nations. History remembers the shoe. It forgets why the shoe mattered. It forgets that Lorenzo Sumulong was telling the truth about Eastern Europe, that Soviet domination of Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia was real and brutal. It forgets that Khrushchev was also telling the truth about American imperialism, about the Philippines being a neo-colonial state, about Western hypocrisy regarding freedom and self-determination. It forgets that both men were trapped in a system that demanded performance over principle, that rewarded rhetoric over reality, that turned genuine grievances into theater. Most of all, it forgets that the General Assembly chamber that day was full of delegates from nations that had been colonized, brutalized, silenced for centuries. And when those delegates saw Khrushchev's rage, some of them, not all, but some, recognized it as their own. Frantz Fanon, the philosopher of anti-colonial struggle, wrote in 1961 in The Wretched of the Earth, "When Khrushchev brandishes his shoe at the United Nations and hammers the table with it, no colonized person, no representative of the underdeveloped countries laughs. For what Khrushchev is demonstrating is that he is treating these wretched capitalists the way they deserve." Fanon was wrong about many things. His prescriptions for decolonization led to violence that accomplished little. His faith in revolutionary violence was misplaced. But he was right about one thing. Rage is a language. And for those who have been systematically denied other languages, rage becomes eloquence. The question is not whether rage is justified. The question is what happens next. What rage builds, what rage destroys, whether rage produces liberation or just more rage. Khrushchev's rage produced nothing. It changed no policies, it freed no nations, it won no arguments, it merely confirmed what the powerful already believed, that he was unfit, that the Soviet Union was barbaric, that the West was right to refuse partnership with such people. But the rage was real. The pain was real. The humiliation was real.
And perhaps that is the final lesson, that in a world where image is reality, where performance is power, where dignity is granted only to those who never lose composure, authenticity becomes a weapon that destroys the one who wields it. The most frequent question asked by tourists on guided tours of the United Nations headquarters, even today, 65 years later, is this: where was Khrushchev sitting when he pounded his shoe? The tour guides point to section 101, third row from the front. They tell the story with practiced ease. They mention the loafer, the gavel, the diplomatic crisis, the Cold War context. They show photographs. They explain the incident's historical significance. What they do not mention, but the official UN history does not record, is that Desk 101 has been replaced 6 times since 1960. The wood has been refinished. The microphones have been upgraded from analog to digital. The chairs have been reupholstered. The entire chamber has been renovated twice. But the number remains: 101. Because some things, once they happen, cannot be erased. They can only be remembered. And in remembering, we must choose what lesson to draw, what meaning to find, what truth to tell ourselves about power and rage and the fragile architectures we build to contain both. Is it a lesson about madmen and empires? About East and West, about winners and losers, about the inevitable triumph of Western civilization over Soviet barbarism? Or is it a lesson about what happens when human beings, pressed beyond their limits, do profoundly human things, lose control, break protocol, shatter decorum, and find themselves judged not for their humanity, but for their failure to perform it correctly? History will remember October 12, 1960, as the day Khrushchev banged.
History will remember October 12, 1960, as the day Khrushchev banged his shoe at the United Nations, the day a Soviet premier lost control, the day the Cold War turned colder, the day that confirmed every Western stereotype about communist unfitness for civilized discourse. But history forgets, or perhaps chooses to forget, that the banging lasted less than 30 seconds, and the consequences lasted a generation. It forgets that the shoe was not the beginning of the story, but the end, that it was the final act in a drama that began with spy planes and collapsed summits and calculated humiliations, that it was engineered, provoked, designed to happen. It forgets that the man holding the shoe was 66 years old, exhausted, wounded, isolated, desperate to be taken seriously by a world that had decided he was a joke. It forgets that everyone in that chamber, American, Soviet, British, French, Indian, Egyptian, Filipino, was trapped in the same system, playing roles assigned by history and ideology and national interest, unable to simply be human because being human was too dangerous, too revealing, too real. And perhaps that is why the shoe endures as a symbol, not because it was shocking or unprecedented or even particularly important in the grand sweep of history, but because for 30 seconds, in front of 2,000 witnesses, a man stopped performing, stopped calculating, stopped being a premier, a leader, a symbol of Soviet power. For 30 seconds, he was just angry, and the world could not forgive him for it.